Hello again, Connecting Point, and this week we're in 2 Samuel chapter 18, and we're starting in verse 19 and going to work our way all the way to verse 8 of chapter 19. Now, over the last number of weeks we've been following through the life of David, and mostly it's been negative things that have been taking place. David's sin, the consequences, and we just have this deterioration of circumstances all the way until David has been really exiled from his kingdom by Absalom. And then we have last week the death of Absalom, and now we have this text where David finds the news of Absalom, finds out the news, and it brings up a whole lot of issues. But what we see now is David being restored. And so we've kind of come to this time of David's life, where he was made king and he was given this great promise by God of a forever kingdom. And it seems like ever since that point, David's life trajectory has been going down. But now we see a turn of things. And so, in spite of what this text looks like, the title I've given it is David being restored. So before we get into the text, I just want you to think about this question. Can you think of some things taught in Scripture that seem counterintuitive or don't seem to make sense? Take a moment, think about that, and we'll be right back and we'll get right into the text. We pick up the story after Absalom, David's son, who Absalom had been leading this rebellion, has been killed by Joab and his men. And now we pick up the story in verse 19 of chapter 18. In chapter 18:19, now Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, said, "Let me run and take the news to the king that the Lord has vindicated him by delivering him from the hand of his enemies." "You are not the one to take the news today," Joab told him. "You may take the news another time, but you must not do so today because the king's son is dead." Then Joab said to a Cushite, "Go tell the king what you have seen." The Cushite bowed down before Joab and ran off. Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, again said to Joab, "Come what may, please let me run behind the Cushite." But Joab replied, "My son, why do you want to go? You don't have any news that will bring you a reward." And he said, "Come what may, I want to run." So Joab said, "Run." Then Ahimaaz ran by way of the plain and outran the Cushite. So this is where today's story begins, with this fella Ahimaaz, who is the son of Zadok. Zadok is a priest, and they're connected into David's kingdom. He wants to be the one who shares the news of victory with King David. However, Joab obviously doesn't think that this is a good idea because it includes the news of the death of the king's son, Absalom. So already early in this text, we can see how at least Joab is concerned over how David might respond to the news. Remember, David's request to the generals was to be gentle with the young man Absalom, which is in 18 verse 5. So Joab gives the assignment to a Cushite, who will remain nameless in the story. We never really know anything more about him other than it's a Cushite. In other words, someone who is not connected and not really seen to be important. So we'll give him the job because however David responds, it won't matter that much. But Ahimaaz was persistent, and Joab finally gave in. And then Joab even warned Ahimaaz that the news wasn't something that would bring a reward. Joab's quite concerned. He's concerned about David's response to the news of his son being killed. But even though the Cushite had a head start Ahimaaz outran the Cushite, and he arrived first with the news. So let's pick it up in verse 24. While David was sitting between the inner and outer gates, the watchman went up to the roof of the gateway by the wall, and as he looked out, he saw a man running alone. The watchman called out to the king and reported it. The king said, "If he is alone, he must have good news." And the runner came closer and closer. Then the watchman saw another runner, and he called down to the gatekeeper, "Look, another man running alone." The king said, "He must be bringing good news too." The watchman said, "It seems to me that the first one runs like Ahimaaz, son of Zadok." "He's a good man," the king said. "He comes with good news." Then Ahimaaz called out to the king, "All is well." He bowed down before the king with his face to the ground and said, "Praise be to the Lord your God. He has delivered up those who lifted their hands against my lord the king." The king asked, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" Ahimaaz answered, "I saw great confusion, just as Joab was about to send the king's servant and me, your servant. I don't know what it was." The king said, "Stand aside and wait here." So he stepped aside and stood there. Then the Cushite arrived and said, "My lord the king, hear the good news. The Lord has vindicated you today by delivering you from the hand of all who rose up against you." The king asked the Cushite, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" The Cushite replied, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up to harm you be like that young man." The king was shaken. He went up to the room over the gateway and wept. As he went, he said, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son, Absalom, if only I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son." So in this section of the scripture, verse 24 to 33, it's about David receiving the news and then his response to the news. Ahimaaz is obviously known. I mean, the watchman sees him running and can tell by the way he runs who it is. And Ahimaaz was so eager to be the one to share the news of victory. He outran the Cushite who had a head start, and it is apparent that he did not anticipate David's response. David was not all that interested in the victory. His primary focus was on the fate of his son Absalom. So in response to David's inquiry, Ahimaaz avoided the question and lost his desire to be the one who would inform David of the events as he gave in to his cowardice. Instead, it was the Cushite who would give David the news. And David's response was one of intense grief and remorse. It seems that all that has happened, starting with David's sin with Bathsheba, then Uriah, then the results of sin, which between Amnon and Tamar, and then Absalom killing Amnon, and then David's rejection of Absalom, and then Absalom plotting to take over Israel, then David's exile from Israel, and then, of course, Absalom's death. All this string of events all come to a head in David's grief. And there's a contrast here. When David was informed of Uriah's death, he displayed a rather casual attitude. See, David was in a mindset of just kind of covering up his own sins. And so he had this casual attitude that this was, just, what will be, will be. This is what happens when there's war. But this was near the beginning of David's downfall. So what leads to this change, where David is now weeping for his enemy, even though it is his son? Now, there's another comparison here. When Saul died, and Saul declared himself to be an enemy of David, David was still, David was in this mindset of being close to the heart of God. And he wept for Saul's death and grieved Saul's death, even though Saul was an enemy. Then when we see David's downfall, we see this completely different attitude, and as he is just very casual about Uriah. And then we see now it changing back to where David's response to the death of essentially his enemy, even though it was a son, is a response of deep grief. So what leads to this change? And I think in terms of what we've been looking at, there's been three important events regarding David. And the one event we covered a few weeks ago, was his response to Shimei. I don't know if you remember Shimei, but you can read about him in chapter 16, 5 to 14, and it's when David is leaving, going down the road, and Shimei is shouting curses at him and insults and basically trash talking David. And one of David's guys says, well, should I go kill him? And then there's an interesting response from David to Shimei. And basically David received Shimei's curses and insults as a deserved rebuke. And so what we begin to see is David beginning to recover his sense of reality and his sense of humility. Rather than being the one who would just take up the sword, just kill anybody in his way, David heard what Shimei was saying, and he took it. And he said, I deserve this. This is a rebuke. And so we begin to see the restoration or the recovery of David's humility. Another important thing that happened was David's trusted advisor, Ahithophel, sided with Absalom in the rebellion of the last few chapters. And Ahithophel became a counselor to Absalom. And what we see when David is informed of this, we see a little bit in chapter 15, verse 31. It says, David prays, Lord, turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness. But there's much more to David's prayer, and it comes out in David's Psalm 55, and I'm going to look at a few verses here. And this is what David wrote in prayer in response to Ahithophel's betrayal. If an enemy were insulting me, I could endure it. If a foe were rising against me, I could hide. But it is you, a man like myself, my companion, my close friend, with whom I once enjoyed sweet fellowship at the house of God as we walked about among the worshippers. Verse 20 of 55 now. My companion attacks his friends, he violates his covenant, his talk is smooth as butter, yet war is in his heart. His words are more soothing than oil, yet they are drawn swords. And so we see David taking this betrayal of a trusted advisor and friend who joined the rebellion against David, and he turns it into prayer. And so we see David returning to prayer. So we have him recovering his humility, and now we see him recovering his prayer life. And thirdly, in this whole series of events, we see David regain his compassion or his love for his son. He had been rejecting Absalom for so long. And over the death of Amnon and all those events, and there seemed to be this thing between David and Absalom that could not be overcome. But in this whole series of events, David regains his compassion for his son, and we see this in his desire, first for his generals or his soldiers to be gentle with Absalom. Don't kill him, be gentle with him. And then when he finds out that he is dead, then he goes into this very deep grief, which is for his son, but I'm also thinking that it was also for all of these events that took place. This kind of domino effect of sin that we've read over the last number of chapters of these books, and this deep grief that overtakes him. And so we see these things being recovered in David, his humility, his prayer, compassion, and just his ability to express sorrow over these things, which is very important. So I want to go to a table talk, and I want you to think about this. Do you have an example in your life of how difficulties or suffering has helped you grow in your faith? Take a minute and think about that, and we'll be back. Okay, we're going to pick it up now in chapter 19, the first verse. Joab was told, "The king is weeping and mourning for Absalom. For the whole army, the victory that day was turned into mourning, because on that day the troops heard it said, 'The king is grieving for his son.' The men stole into the city that day as men steal in who are ashamed, and when they flee from battle. The king covered his face and cried aloud, 'O my son Absalom, O Absalom, my son, my son.' Then Joab went into the house to the king and said, 'Today you have humiliated all your men, who have just saved your life and the lives of your sons and daughters and the lives of your wives and concubines. You love those who hate you, and you hate those who love you. You have made it clear today that the commanders and their men mean nothing to you. I see that you would be pleased if Absalom were alive today and all of us were dead. Now go out and encourage your men. I swear by the Lord that if you don't go out, not a man will be left with you by nightfall. This will be worse for you than all the calamities that have come on you from your youth till now.' So the king got up and took his seat in the gateway. When the men were told, 'The king is sitting in the gateway,' they all came before him. Meanwhile, the Israelites had fled to their homes." So the word had spread throughout the army that the king was mourning for Absalom, and what was supposed to be a great victory celebration, restoring the throne of Israel to David, became a very somber occasion. The army returned not in the manner of a celebrating side, but in the manner of a side that had been defeated. And so as David mourns and the army is in this kind of a mournful attitude as well, who's going to talk to David? And probably the only guy in the kingdom that could handle this was Joab. So Joab went in to address the king at this particular time. And Joab makes a statement regarding David which is intended as a criticism. But he says this statement. He goes, "You love those who hate you and hate those who love you." I find that a very interesting statement as we see David being broken, as we see the brokenness of David leading him back closer to the heart of God. Joab makes this observation, and it's, it seems true. He's mourning for his enemy and not really celebrating the victory and the sacrifice and the effort that the army has put in. But in this statement that Joab makes, "You love those who hate you and hate those who love you," we see in David a glimpse into the values of the forever kingdom, of the kingdom of Jesus. It's interesting that in Matthew 5:44, Jesus says these words, "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." And then later on in Matthew 10:37-39, Jesus says, "Anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves their son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever does not take up their cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake will find it." And so Joab, in his statement, "You love those who hate you," this is something that Jesus would teach, to love our enemies and to pray for those who would persecute us. And to hate those who love you, well, the New Testament application is that our greatest love should be that for Christ, even greater than for our families and greater than anything. And when we find the meaning of our life just merely here on the planet, then we'll lose our life. But if we are dedicated in our heart and walk close to Jesus, then we find our life. And I think this is something that that David was perhaps modeling that day. Maybe he didn't know it, but we're beginning to see this change of values in David. And in this text, Joab then tells the king what to do. Imagine that. That's going to take some courage. However, David actually does what he is told. Right? Is David just not emotionally ready to make decisions, and so he just follows Joab's advice? Did Joab preserve David's kingdom that day? Possibly. David takes his place at the gate where the men could access him, and the rest of Israel, they fled to their homes. The rest being the ones that were probably following Absalom. And we can only speculate on what David and his men talked about at the gate. Was it to do with loss and grief and things that, maybe we regret? We don't know. But what we do know is they did not record anything about having a great victory celebration. So it's interesting, this attitude that David, before he, went on his kind of negative trajectory, and after, sinning with Bathsheba, and through that time of life with all those dominoes, sin upon sin upon sin. But before that, David, he was concerned for his enemy Saul. And now he's concerned, even though it is his son, it's his enemy. He's grieving greatly for his son. And he has this particular attitude about enemies. And so I'd like to consider that as we come to a close on this text. How is our spiritual growth and maturity connected to our attitude toward our, in quotes, enemies, or towards ones we have difficulty with? Take time to think about that, and if you can, to have some discussion around that. And then take time to pray together around these two points that really come out of this text, is the value of suffering and going through suffering, and how suffering is used to bring us back close to the heart of God. And then how our attitude towards our enemies is somewhat of a gauge of the condition of our heart toward God as well. So take some time, think about that, and pray about that, and we'll pick it up next week.